She appeared with the storm, drenched, silent, and already too late. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Rivela. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Drop it in the comments below. Reading your thoughts always brightens my day. Let's begin. It was the sort of late October morning that pressed itself against the windows with a grey persistence, the fog clinging to Baker Street like a damp shroud. The gas lamps flickered pale and uncertain in the murk, and even the rhythmic clatter of hooves upon cobblestone seemed muffled, as if the very air had grown thick with secrets. I was reading the day's Times, or rather attempting to, for my mind was still occupied with the lingering details of a medical consultation I had attended the evening before. Opposite me, Sherlock Holmes sat cross-legged in the armchair, motionless except for the occasional rise and fall of his pipe smoke. He had not spoken for the better part of an hour. Without lifting his eyes, he said, "You might find the obituaries more compelling today, Watson." I blinked at the paper, then glanced over the top at him. "You mean to imply that something of interest is buried among the recently departed?" "There is often more life in the dead than in the living, if one knows where to look," Holmes murmured cryptically. He tapped the ash from his pipe into the tray. "But no, not today. I was merely making conversation." Just then, the bell rang, once briskly, and then again, with a more uncertain hesitation. "2 rings," Holmes said, rising fluidly to his feet. The first confident, the second nervous. "We are to expect a visitor of wavering resolve. Likely a woman, mid-30s or above, carrying something, likely an umbrella, based on the rhythm of the ring and the pause between." I gave him a look. "All from a bell?" But I was silenced by the click of the doorknob and the sound of Mrs. Hudson's voice in the hallway. A moment later, she stepped into the room, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and concern. "There's a lady here to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Says it's urgent. Won't give a name." "Show her in," Holmes said, already moving to straighten the papers on his desk. The door opened fully, and the woman entered with a hesitant step. She was tall, her posture refined, with an elegance about her that even her current distress could not obscure. Her coat was the deep hue of storm-slick cobblestones, and she held a closed umbrella in gloved hands. But it was her dress, just visible beneath the hem of the coat, that caught the eye, a swirling fabric of unusual color, as though woven from rain itself, gray, silver, hints of blue, shimmering slightly as she moved. It was an odd, ghostly thing. I had never seen such a shade. Holmes studied her silently for a long moment, then gestured toward the chair opposite the fireplace. "Please, do sit down, madam. You're troubled, clearly, but not panicked, and I take it you've come from the north, though not by train. The mud on your hem and the dampness of your umbrella suggest a carriage ride through Hampstead, perhaps." The woman blinked, clearly startled. "You're quite right, Mr. Holmes. I did ride from Hampstead." "How could you know?" Holmes merely offered her a faint smile. "It's my profession to notice. Tell me, what brings the lady in the rain-colored dress to Baker Street this morning?" The woman looked down at her hands for a moment before speaking. "My name is Isadora Fenwick. I am, or was, the companion to Lady Agatha Warburton of Maple Heath Manor." Holmes narrowed his eyes slightly. "Lady Agatha, widow of the Viscount Warburton, a recluse by reputation. Died last spring, did she not?" "Yes," Miss Fenwick said softly. "But I don't believe she died naturally." I sat forward in my chair, the fog outside momentarily forgotten. Holmes did not speak. He only tilted his head a fraction, signaling for her to go on. "She passed away in her sleep, or so the doctor claimed," Miss Fenwick said. "There was no inquiry, no police, no scandal, but I know her habits, I know her fears. She had recently become convinced that someone was watching the house. She told me, twice, that she feared she would be silenced before the frost. And now—" She opened her reticule and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I found this 2 nights ago, hidden behind the false drawer of her escritoire." Holmes accepted the paper with gloved fingers and unfolded it slowly. It was a note. The writing was jagged, the ink smudged, and though several words were illegible, one phrase leapt off the page. "The lady in the rain-colored dress sees too much." There was silence in the room for a full half-minute. Then Holmes spoke, his voice cool but sharp. "Miss Fenwick, you shall not return to Maple Heath unaccompanied. Dr. Watson and I will accompany you tomorrow morning. I believe your instincts are correct." He tapped the note once on his knee. "Because whoever wrote this, whoever feared you enough to write it, did so after Lady Agatha's death." Miss Fenwick turned pale. I rose slowly. "Holmes, you mean—" "Yes, Watson," he said, his eyes gleaming now with that peculiar energy that only the most stimulating puzzles could bring to life in him. "The dead do not write warnings." The rain tapped gently against the window pane as Miss Fenwick sat quietly, her hands clenched around her umbrella. Holmes had not moved from his position since she finished speaking, save for the steady tapping of his fingers against the arm of his chair. His gaze remained on the note she had presented, and I could see the familiar transformation settle over him, the quiet intensity, the quickening calculation behind his still eyes. At last, he spoke. "Miss Fenwick, before we journey to Maple Heath, I must understand the full scope of your association with Lady Agatha. You were her companion for how long?" 7 years, she replied. "Since shortly after her husband passed. She had few relations and little trust in the outside world. I lived in the manor with her, attended to her letters, her appointments, what few there were, and read to her in the evenings. It was not a glamorous post, but I was devoted to her." "And her mind in recent months?" Holmes asked, steepling his fingers. "Any suggestion that she was becoming unstable, forgetful?" "None. She had always been particular, perhaps eccentric, but never confused. She kept her own accounts, managed correspondence meticulously. That is why, when she began speaking of someone watching her from the trees, I believed her. She was not prone to fanciful imagination." Holmes gave a slight nod. "Describe Maple Heath Manor." Miss Fenwick inhaled slowly, as though bracing herself to revisit the image. "It sits on a low rise just north of Hampstead. The house is large, Victorian Gothic, ivy crawling up the east wall like veins. There's a perimeter of trees, dense and overgrown in parts. Inside, the manor is tidy but dated. Lady Agatha insisted on maintaining her late husband's study exactly as he'd left it, untouched." "Any staff besides yourself?" "2. Mr. Hensley, the groundskeeper. He's been with the estate for decades. And Mrs. Prewitt, the housekeeper. She comes from the village each morning and leaves by sundown. I was the only one who stayed through the night." Holmes rose and walked to the fireplace, examining the fading embers as if they might offer him some additional clue. He turned slightly toward her. "And after Lady Agatha passed, what became of the manor?" Miss Fenwick looked down, her voice dropping. "Her will named a nephew, Mr. Lucien Warburton, as heir. I had met him only twice before. A cold man. After the funeral, he dismissed me within the week." "Yet you remained nearby," Holmes observed. "You said you returned to the manor 2 nights ago." "I did. I arranged for Mrs. Prewitt to let me in during her cleaning hours. She still feels some loyalty to me. I pretended I'd left a keepsake behind, but truly, I wanted to examine Lady Agatha's writing desk. She often hid private notes there. That's where I found the letter." "Interesting," Holmes murmured, his eyes flickering. "And did you encounter Mr. Warburton on your visit?" "Number. He wasn't present. The study door was locked, but the escritoire is in her bedroom. I was careful, swift." Holmes returned to his chair, then turned toward me. "Watson, what strikes you about Miss Fenwick's account?" I hesitated. "That Lady Agatha feared being silenced. And now, someone has taken steps to ensure Miss Fenwick is kept away." Holmes gave a short, satisfied nod. Precisely. The letter is more than a warning. It's a veiled threat. One composed after the woman's death, perhaps by someone with intimate access to the house. Miss Fenwick's hands tightened on her umbrella. "I've not spoken of this to anyone else," she whispered. "If there is danger, I thought only you might understand it." Holmes looked at her with the faintest suggestion of warmth, his equivalent of reassurance. "You were wise to come. We depart for Maple Heath tomorrow. The truth rarely stays buried long when the soil is stirred correctly." The following morning found us in a hired cab, clattering northward through the thinning fog. The city faded behind us as bare branches clawed the sky on either side of the Hampstead Road. Miss Fenwick sat quietly beside Holmes, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on the passing trees. As the road curved and the manor came into view, I found myself struck by the building's solemnity. Maple Heath stood like a brooding sentinel, its grey stones softened only slightly by the creeping ivy that scaled its facade. The air here seemed thinner, the silence almost unnatural. Holmes stepped from the cab before it had fully stopped and turned in a slow circle, examining the grounds before we even reached the door. "Notice the soil along the path, Watson," he murmured. "Recently disturbed, not by the wheels of our carriage. Those marks are older. Someone was walking here at night, alone or in haste." Miss Fenwick produced a small key and unlocked the side entrance. We passed through a narrow servants' hallway and emerged into a modest drawing room. The air was still and cold, and I could smell faint traces of beeswax and lavender. "This way," she said. "Her bedroom remains untouched." We followed her up a curving staircase, the carpet worn thin at the center. The bedroom was dim, the heavy curtains drawn. Miss Fenwick approached the escritoire and gestured. The letter was tucked behind the second drawer, under the wood panel. Holmes knelt and examined the space carefully. Then, with a small flick of his knife, he lifted the false panel and peered beneath. After a moment, he gave a quiet, and retrieved a second item, a small, broken pencil tip. "Curious," he said. "This is not from the same implement used to compose the letter. The graphite is softer, more modern. Someone else has used this desk recently." He rose and turned slowly toward the doorway. "I'd like to see the study, the one Lady Agatha preserved for her husband." Miss Fenwick blinked. "It's always kept locked. Mr. Warburton forbade access." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then it's precisely where we must go." To our surprise, the door to the study was ajar when we reached it. Holmes paused, listening intently, then pushed it open. The room was shadowed but not unkempt. Books lined the walls. A large oak desk stood at the far end, flanked by an empty armchair. Dust lay thick on the surface, except for one curious place. Holmes approached the desk and ran a finger along a rectangular patch of exposed wood. Something was removed recently. A small box, perhaps, and not by someone overly cautious. He crouched again and examined the carpet near the chair. "Watson, note the scuff marks. Someone has sat here frequently. The heel impressions suggest a man's shoe. Narrow, high-arched. Probably Warburton himself." Just then, a voice called up the stairs. "Miss Fenwick, are you here?" We turned to see a man standing at the doorway, dressed in a long black coat and gloves. His eyes were sharp, his manner guarded. "Lucien Warburton," Miss Fenwick said quietly. "This is Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. They are visiting." Warburton's eyes flicked to Holmes. "Indeed. For what purpose?" Holmes stepped forward, the picture of polite coolness. "Curiosity, Mr. Warburton. I've heard of your uncle's library." Warburton's lips thinned. "This room is private. I must ask you to leave it." Holmes inclined his head. "Of course. We were just on our way." As we stepped past him, Holmes's eyes lingered on Warburton's gloves, then dropped to a faint smear of graphite on his left thumb. He said nothing as we descended the stairs. Once outside, back among the trees that ringed the estate, Holmes turned to me with a curious expression. "Watson," he said softly, "the house is not the key. The answer lies beneath it, or rather, what was once beneath it." I stared at him. "You believe Lady Agatha's death is tied to something hidden on the grounds?" Holmes nodded once. "And Mr. Warburton, I suspect, is not looking for an inheritance. He's looking for something else, something his aunt meant to protect." He turned and began walking toward the edge of the property, his eyes scanning the earth. "A secret buried in more than just metaphor, Watson. And if we are not quick, someone else may dig it up first." The garden behind Maple Heath Manor sloped gently downward, yielding to a copse of trees that loomed like silent witnesses over the edge of the property. Holmes strode ahead, his boots crunching over damp leaves, his gaze fixed not on the canopy above, but on the ground, scanning with that peculiar intensity he reserved for puzzles of the most elusive sort. I followed, though with some effort. The morning mist had lifted somewhat, but the earth remained soft from the prior week's rains, and each step threatened to sink into the loam. Behind us, Miss Fenwick lingered on the flagstone path, casting uneasy glances back toward the manor. Lucien Warburton had not followed, but I sensed that his absence was not the same as disinterest. "You believe something was hidden here?" I asked Holmes as we reached a low stone wall, now cracked and blanketed with moss. Holmes crouched and brushed away a section of leaves with the sleeve of his coat. "I believe Lady Agatha was guarding something. The preserved study, the hidden letter, the phrase about the woman who sees too much. They all point toward a larger truth concealed on these grounds, and I intend to find its outline." He tapped a patch of uneven stone with the head of his walking stick. It gave a hollow sound. "Ah," he said softly. "Come here, Watson. Look at this." I knelt beside him. The stones, once laid in an orderly ring, formed what appeared to be the crumbled border of an old well or foundation. One corner had sagged deeply into the earth, and amidst the cracks were tiny splinters of wood and rusted nails. "This," Holmes murmured, "was no garden folly. I would wager it was once a root cellar or ice house, common among estates of a certain age. Forgotten now, but useful, if one needed to conceal something out of sight, yet not far from hand." He stood abruptly and glanced toward the tree line. "Come, there's something else." The perimeter, we moved west, where the line of trees pressed in closer to the manor. Holmes walked slowly now, his eyes flicking over every broken branch, every bent stalk of grass. Then he paused, raising a hand. "There," he said. A set of prints, faint but distinct, led from the rear of the house to the tree line. They were not those of boots, but rather narrow shoes, the kind a man might wear indoors or while pacing a drawing room, yet here they were, pressed into soft earth and angled as though someone had stood silently for some time, watching the house. Holmes knelt again, measured the stride, the weight. Recent, no more than 2 nights old, the very night Miss Fenwick returned. My blood chilled slightly. Then someone was watching her, or following her, Holmes said. Someone aware she'd come back for something, someone with reason to be afraid of what she might uncover. He stood and turned back toward the manor. "We must speak to the groundskeeper." "Mr. Hensley?" I asked. "Yes. If anyone knows the land's older secrets, it is the man who tends them." We returned to the rear of the house, where Miss Fenwick directed us to the small cottage beside the stables. Mr. Hensley answered the door with the wary stiffness of a man unused to visitors. He was gray of beard and hunched in posture, but his eyes were sharp and his handshake firm. "I know who you are," he said after Holmes introduced himself. "Saw you in the papers once. Solved the Rivington affair, didn't you?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Among others. I wonder if I might ask you about the grounds, specifically the old structures no longer in use." Hensley led us around the side of the cottage, where a warped map of the estate was tacked to a board. He tapped a long, wrinkled finger against the rear of the garden. There used to be an ice house yonder, stone and brick, built before my time but filled in long ago, after Lady Agatha's father died. Never rebuilt. Why filled in? Holmes asked. Collapsed roof, they said, dangerous to children and servants. No one's spoken of it in years. Holmes looked thoughtful. Has anyone been exploring the area recently? Digging, disturbing the soil? Hensley squinted toward the trees. I saw Mr. Warburton walk the perimeter last week. First time I've ever known him to take interest. Had a gardener's spade with him, but I assumed he was, well, grieving, perhaps. Holmes gave a short nod. One final question. Did Lady Agatha ever mention anything hidden on the estate? Papers, items, anything her husband left behind? At that, Hensley's expression changed. Not quite fear, but a guarded caution, as though an old memory had stirred from its sleep. There was something. Once, years ago, she called me into the study late at night, asked if I remembered the old strong-box Sir Edmund kept hidden in the cellar before it was filled. I said I didn't. She looked disappointed, told me it held something that didn't belong to the family, something dangerous. What happened after? I asked. She told me never to mention it again. I didn't. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then I suspect that box, or what remains of it, may be our next destination. We thanked the man and returned through the garden as twilight deepened, the last of the sun glinting off the upper windows of the manor. The air had grown still, and even the birds had quieted. Inside, we found Warburton seated in the drawing-room, a book open on his lap, though he clearly had not turned a page. "You've had your tour," he said coldly. "May I ask how much longer you intend to intrude on family business?" Holmes smiled disarmingly. "We intrude only upon curiosity, Mr. Warburton. But if I may be frank, there is one final area I must examine. The rear cellar. We understand there may be remnants of the old ice house worth investigating." Warburton's expression barely shifted, but I saw a tightening at the corners of his mouth. "There is nothing there, a pile of rotted stone and rain-soaked earth." "Nonetheless," Holmes said gently, "I feel drawn to it. I shall trouble you no further afterward." Warburton rose. "You will do as you please, I suspect." "Very well, I shall light your way. But do not expect to find anything more than a few nesting rats and old clay." We took lanterns and made our way into the rear garden once more. Warburton walked ahead, his boots crunching heavily. He stopped beside the broken stone outline and gestured. "There. Dig if you must." Holmes crouched and began clearing the surface stones with swift efficiency, revealing more of the collapsed structure. After a few minutes he paused and withdrew a thin iron rod from his coat. He pressed it into the soil, once, twice, then a third time. With the third press, the rod sank deeper. "Watson, here." I joined him, and together we began clearing with our hands, pushing aside the debris and sodden leaves. After several minutes, our fingers struck something solid. Wood, warped and cracked, but clearly shaped. A lid. Holmes cleared it further, revealing a brass hinge and the edge of a broken padlock. The box was wedged at an angle beneath the roots of a creeping tree. With care, we lifted it out, its weight substantial. Holmes pried it open with the butt of his cane. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a stack of parchment, letters, documents, and atop them, a small velvet pouch. He opened it carefully and let the contents spill into his hand. A cluster of unset gemstones, deep red, gleamed in the lantern light. Warburton gave a soft, involuntary intake of breath. Holmes looked up, his expression unreadable. "Ah," he said, "the missing Warburton rubies. Stolen from the Crown's diplomatic treasury in 1859. Never recovered." Warburton said nothing, Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And I believe this is what your aunt died protecting." The lantern flickered in the wind. Somewhere in the trees, an owl gave a single cry. We all stood silent as the weight of revelation settled like mist upon the earth. Holmes's hand remained perfectly still, the rubies resting in his palm like frozen blood, their deep crimson glint catching what little lantern light the mist hadn't swallowed. Beside him, Warburton stood unnaturally straight, though his breath had become shallow. A man taught from birth to mask his thoughts would still betray much in the silence between his words, and Holmes, ever the student of silence, was listening more intently now than ever. "Extraordinary," Holmes said quietly. "So much deception for something so small." He lowered his hand slowly, returning the stones to the pouch before slipping it into his coat. "Tell me, Mr. Warburton," he said without looking up, "did your uncle ever speak of these to you?" Warburton's jaw tensed. "No." "Your aunt?" "No." Holmes raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He stood and turned back toward the manor, brushing soil from his gloves with mechanical precision. "Then let us step out of the cold and into the truth." Back inside the drawing room, the fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Miss Fenwick waited near the mantelpiece, her expression unreadable until she saw Holmes enter with the damp, earth-streaked box in his arms. When she noticed the velvet pouch, a hand rose involuntarily to her mouth. "I don't understand," she whispered. Holmes placed the box gently on the table and opened it, revealing the rubies and the bundle of aged documents. "Your Lady Agatha," he said, "was in possession of a secret too valuable to entrust to paper. But even secrets that are buried eventually rise." He unwrapped one of the oilskin bundles, revealing yellowed pages, letters and ledger entries bearing official seals, some torn, some faded with time. "These," he said, tapping a page gently, "are records of a shipment that never reached its destination. In 1859, a diplomatic envoy traveling from Calais to London was ambushed. Among the lost items was a set of rubies belonging to a foreign dignitary, intended as a wedding gift to the British Crown. The matter was hushed, classified as a theft by highwaymen. No arrests, no trail." He turned to Warburton, whose eyes had not left the box. "And yet they weren't lost at all. They were brought here, hidden, likely by Sir Edmund himself." Miss Fenwick's brow furrowed. "But why? Why would he do such a thing?" "A question of greed, I imagine," Holmes said. "Perhaps Sir Edmund took possession of the gems during his tenure with the Foreign Office. Perhaps he merely happened upon them by accident and made a choice. Either way, he kept them, but not carelessly. He buried them, locked them away, and when he died, your Lady Agatha inherited not just the estate, but the burden of concealment." Warburton stepped forward suddenly. "You speak as if this is settled fact, Mr. Holmes, but you cannot possibly know she understood what she was protecting. Perhaps she found them and panicked. Perhaps she meant to destroy them." Holmes turned to him, calm as still water. "If she intended to destroy them, Mr. Warburton, she would not have left a note warning Miss Fenwick. She feared someone in this house would do otherwise." Warburton's expression hardened, the last traces of diplomacy vanishing from his voice. "You have no proof I was involved." "I never said you were involved," Holmes replied mildly. "But you have implicated yourself now. I only ever said that the box was hidden and the contents valuable. You provided the rest." Silence fell like a guillotine. Warburton's shoulders dropped slightly, and he turned to the fire, his voice low. "I knew my aunt was hiding something. I suspected it had to do with Sir Edmund, but I never imagined this. When she died, I searched her desk, then the study. When I found the sealed drawer empty, I thought Miss Fenwick had taken something, so I followed her that night." Miss Fenwick gasped, stepping back. "You were in the trees, watching." "I wasn't going to hurt you," he snapped, his composure cracking. I wanted to know what you had, if it was blackmail or leverage. My family's name was everything. Holmes folded his arms. So you searched the study, the grounds. You returned to the collapsed ice house in secret, but you didn't find the box. No, Warburton said quietly. I found only broken roots and rotting stones. I gave up the next day. And when you saw Miss Fenwick again? I asked. I confronted her in the village. She told me nothing. I assumed whatever had been hidden was long gone. Holmes gave a short sigh. How convenient that would have been. But Lady Agatha left behind more than a secret. She left the trace of a conscience, a final act of clarity before death. He moved to the window, staring out into the dark. The question now, he continued, is what shall be done? These stones belong neither to the Warburton estate nor to any private hand. They are stolen property of international significance. To keep them would be a crime. To sell them, an act of treason. To report them is our duty. Warburton looked away, his face pale. Miss Fenwick stood straighter. Then do it. Let the truth be known. Lady Agatha would not have wanted them to remain hidden if it meant someone else might die for them. Holmes nodded once, approvingly. Then tomorrow morning I shall deliver them to the Foreign Office, along with copies of the ledgers. The Crown may choose to repatriate them, or not. Either way, the Warburton curse will be laid to rest. A log cracked in the hearth. The night deepened. We stayed the evening, as travel back to London would have been impossible in the dark. Holmes barely slept. I found him in the early hours, seated by the drawing-room window, the velvet pouch beside his tea. He didn't turn as I entered. "What troubles you, Holmes?" I asked softly. He spoke without looking up. "It is a curious thing, Watson. So much blood over so little. Rubies the size of a child's thumb, and yet they've toppled reputations, haunted a widow, and nearly driven a man to desperation. And yet they're just stones." "Precisely. The evil is not in them, but in what men hope to gain from them." He paused. "Still, I wonder, what became of the 11th gem?" I blinked. 11th? There were 12 originally. The pouch held 11. One is missing. My stomach sank. "Do you believe Mr. Warburton?" "No," Holmes said. "Not this time. He looked as surprised as you or I when I opened the pouch." "Then who?" Holmes glanced upward, his expression distant. "Perhaps we shall never know. Or perhaps the truth will find its way back to us in time." He closed the pouch and slipped it into a small case. "For now," he said, "we leave the manor. The dead have spoken, and the living must answer." Dawn crept reluctantly across the moorland horizon, painting the skies over Hampstead in hesitant bands of silver and slate. The fog, as if reluctant to surrender its hold, lingered in the hollows of the earth like a final whisper. We departed Maple Heath Manor without ceremony. Warburton offered no farewell, his silhouette visible only as a still figure in the upper window, unmoving as we stepped into the waiting carriage. Miss Fenwick, pale but composed, sat opposite Holmes and me, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Neither of us spoke until the manor had faded from view, its spires swallowed by the morning mist. Then Holmes broke the silence. "There is a thread still loose," he said. "One that irritates me more the longer I consider it." "The missing ruby?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Indeed. 11 stones. A set that, in every record I've consulted over the years, has always numbered 12. That discrepancy cannot be overlooked, not in a case where every other detail has been so meticulously concealed." Miss Fenwick shifted slightly. "Could it not have been lost, buried separately?" "Unlikely," Holmes replied. "The velvet pouch is intact. There was no sign of tampering. Someone removed that 12th gem deliberately, and recently." "Then it's possible it never left the manor?" I said. Holmes gave me a glance of cautious approval. Very possible. But what troubles me more is this: the implication of knowledge. Someone knew precisely what they were looking for. Someone who moved with enough discretion to escape even Warburton's suspicion. That requires opportunity, access, and motive. His eyes flicked toward Miss Fenwick. She stiffened. "You don't believe I took it?" "I believe," Holmes said, his voice measured, "that you were in possession of Lady Agatha's trust, and that you were in the manor, unsupervised 2 nights ago. That affords you the means. But I do not yet understand your motive, if any." She turned toward the window, the reflection of the misty countryside flickering in her eyes. "I loved Lady Agatha. I would never defile what she protected." Holmes regarded her for a moment longer, then nodded as though satisfied. For now. Back at Baker Street, Holmes disappeared almost as soon as we arrived, vanishing into his bedroom for what he referred to as meditative withdrawal. I knew better than to disturb him. Instead, I spent the day in a quiet corner of the sitting room, attempting to order my thoughts in my journal, reviewing our discoveries. Lady Agatha's hidden warning, the rubies, the ledger, Warburton's failed concealment, and of course, the lingering absence of that final gem. It was not until nearly nightfall that Holmes emerged, freshly shaved, eyes bright, movements precise. "I have requested a visit," he said briskly, "from an acquaintance in the Foreign Office. The name of Sir Athelney Smale may mean little to the world, but within certain halls of government he is quite influential. He has agreed to meet us at the Diogenes Club within the hour." I closed my journal and rose. "Then we're delivering the rubies to the Crown?" "In due course," Holmes said. "But first I must confirm a suspicion." The Diogenes Club was as austere as ever, its silence more deafening than any noise. In a private room draped with velvet curtains, Sir Athelney Smale waited, a thin man with silver-rimmed spectacles and a permanent look of someone unimpressed by the world around him. Holmes greeted him with his usual lack of ceremony and presented the velvet pouch with a flick of the wrist. Smale peered at the stones with a scholar's disinterest, then selected a single ledger from the accompanying documents. "These are authentic," he said after a moment. "There's no doubt, and remarkably well preserved." "There were 12 originally," Holmes said softly. Smale nodded. "That is so. The Crown was never able to recover them. The embarrassment was buried along with the case." "Would it be possible," Holmes asked, "for someone within your office or adjacent to it to have knowledge of the shipment's specifics? Enough to recognize the gems and their origin if they were rediscovered?" Smale hesitated. Very few would possess the clearance. Fewer still the inclination. "Why?" "Because one of the gems is missing," Holmes said. "Removed after the box was unearthed. I believe we are dealing with someone who has intimate knowledge of what these stones are, and who believes the authorities will be too grateful for 11 to notice the 12th. Smale frowned deeply. "A serious implication." "Quite," Holmes said. "That's why I need the list, however limited, of anyone with recent access to the Crown's archival record of the Warburton case. I must know who else might be keeping this secret." Smale nodded stiffly. "It will take me the night." Holmes bowed slightly. "Then I'll return tomorrow." As we stepped into the street, the lamps flickered in the rising wind, and Holmes pulled his collar tighter. "There's another piece," he said, "that refuses to align. The original note Miss Fenwick brought us, 'The lady in the rain-colored dress sees too much.' It was not addressed to Lady Agatha. It was about Miss Fenwick. And written after Agatha's death," I added. "Precisely. Meaning someone considered her a threat. Someone who saw her presence at Maple Heath as dangerous. Not because she was grieving or curious, but because she might expose what they themselves had done." He stopped walking. "Watson, recall the letter's phrasing. It did not say she knows too much. It said she sees too much. A subtle but meaningful difference. The writer feared not what she understood, but what she might notice." We stared at each other a moment. "She saw something," I said slowly, without realizing it. Holmes turned on his heel and strode swiftly toward Baker Street. And we must find out what it was, before whoever wrote that note decides to remove the threat entirely. By the time we reached the sitting room once more, the gas lights were lit and Mrs. Hudson had prepared tea. Holmes didn't touch it. He paced, hands folded behind his back, until finally he said, "We must speak to her again. And this time, not as protectors. As investigators." He penned a quick note to Miss Fenwick, requesting her presence at Baker Street. She arrived within the hour, wrapped in a dark green shawl, her expression guarded. Holmes gestured for her to sit. "Miss Fenwick, I need you to think very carefully. When you returned to Maple Heath that night, what did you observe before you found the letter?" She blinked, clearly caught off guard. The hallway was cold. The air had that stagnant feeling, as though something had recently been disturbed. I remember thinking the curtains in the study had been drawn when they were usually open. "Anything else?" I passed the housekeeper's closet. The door was slightly ajar. I saw a shadow move behind it. I thought perhaps it was Mrs. Prewitt. Holmes leaned forward. "But she was not supposed to be there at that hour." "No," she said slowly. "No, she was not." "And did you confront her?" I didn't think." "You didn't see her," Holmes interrupted. "But you assumed." He stood. "Watson, I believe it is time we had a word with Mrs. Prewitt, not at Maple Heath. Here, quietly, before someone else ensures she cannot speak." Miss Fenwick's voice was barely above a whisper. "You think the housekeeper took the 12th gem?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "I think she saw more than she should have, and someone fears she might now talk." He picked up his coat once more. "Come, Watson. We must retrieve her before the next silence becomes permanent." We arrived at the modest cottage of Mrs. Prewitt just as the street lamps were beginning to cast their long shadows across the stone path. It was a quiet dwelling nestled at the edge of the village, neat in appearance, though the hedge out front had grown a little wild, perhaps a sign that its inhabitant had more pressing concerns than gardening of late. Holmes knocked lightly at the door, not with urgency, but with careful precision, as if to signal our intent before our presence. After a pause, the door creaked open. Mrs. Prewitt appeared in the gap, her lined face backlit by the warm glow of a fire behind her. Her eyes, sharp and suspicious, darted between Holmes and me before softening slightly in recognition. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice gravelly with age, "and Dr. Watson, what brings you here at this hour?" Holmes inclined his head, an unusual matter. "May we come in?" She hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. "Mind your boots, I just scrubbed the floors." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lavender polish and coal smoke. A kettle hummed faintly on the hearth. Holmes waited until she had settled into her chair before taking his own beside the small table. "We've returned from Maple Heath," he began, "and we're trying to piece together the final days of Lady Agatha's life, particularly in regard to a matter of inheritance and secrecy." Mrs. Prewitt shifted uncomfortably. "I was only her housekeeper. I didn't know her mind." "But you were present in her home," Holmes said, "and present again when Miss Fenwick returned, were you not?" The old woman stiffened. Holmes raised a hand. "Please do not trouble yourself to deny it. Miss Fenwick recalls seeing your shadow behind the closet door, and I suspect you saw something that night, perhaps something you've been too afraid to admit." Her eyes narrowed. "Afraid? Of what?" Holmes's tone softened. "Of being implicated in something you never asked to be part of." There was silence. Then she looked at him directly. "You think I took something?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that you may have seen someone take something, and if so, your silence could endanger not only your safety, but your conscience." Mrs. Prewitt leaned back, her lips drawn tight. "I saw someone, yes. But I didn't say a word, because I didn't want to be dragged into the affairs of gentry." I've scrubbed those floors since I was a girl. They've never paid me more than civility. But Lady Agatha, she was different. She always said please and thank you. Always asked after my boy. She looked away, blinking rapidly. Holmes waited. I was in the closet, sorting linens, she continued at last. I wasn't hiding, but I heard the front door creak just a little. I peeked through the slats and saw him. Mr. Warburton. Holmes gave no sign of surprise. What did he do? He went straight up to Lady Agatha's room. He moved quietly, like a man who'd done it before. And he found something? He left with nothing in his hands, but I saw him pause near the escritoire. He pried something from underneath. I didn't see what, but I heard the drawer catch. When he turned, his expression was strange. Not triumph exactly, more like relief. Holmes steepled his fingers, and the next morning, he was gone before sunup, left the manor without saying a word. Holmes stood. Thank you, Mrs. Prewitt. You've been braver than you know. At the door he paused. One more question. Have you seen this before? From his coat he drew the velvet pouch, empty of its contents, and held it in the lamplight. She studied it. That was in Lady Agatha's bottom drawer, wrapped in muslin. I dusted around it dozens of times, but never looked inside. I figured it was just baubles or old love letters. Holmes nodded. If only. We stepped into the night once more, and the cold greeted us like an open hand. Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, his pace slow, thoughtful. She confirms Warburton entered that room, I said, but he left empty-handed. Precisely, Holmes murmured, which means two things. One, that he likely failed to retrieve what he was looking for, at least that night, and two, that someone else arrived after him. Mrs. Prewitt. Holmes shook his head. Number she had neither the opportunity nor the desire. She has told the truth as far as she knows it. Then who? Holmes stopped suddenly beneath a gaslight. The flame above us trembled in the wind. Think, Watson. Someone present in the house during the transition. Someone familiar with Lady Agatha's patterns. Someone dismissed without ceremony, but left with time to act. Someone who claimed to find the letter behind the false drawer. I blinked. Miss Fenwick. Holmes looked at me gravely. She told us she discovered the warning letter, but she also knew exactly where to find it, and she made certain it reached me, knowing it would draw our attention not just to the estate, but to her role in the household. But she seemed sincere. She feared for her safety. Yes, Holmes agreed. And sincerity, when rehearsed to the point of perfection, can be the finest lie of all. A hansom cab passed us, wheels hissing over damp stone. Holmes resumed walking. She may not be guilty, he said, but I must confront her again, this time with more than questions. With knowledge back at Baker Street, I waited as Holmes drafted a second note, short and direct. Within the hour, Miss Fenwick appeared, her shawl damp from the mist, her cheeks flushed. You summoned me again, Mr. Holmes, she said carefully. Is there news? Holmes gestured toward the hearth. There is clarity. Please, sit. She did so, cautiously. Holmes regarded her with a gentleness that belied the firmness of his voice. Miss Fenwick, do you still possess the 12th ruby? She said nothing for 3 long seconds. Then she gave a sharp laugh, but there was no mirth in it. I suppose I should have known you'd discover it. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Why take it? She swallowed hard. Because it was mine, or rather, it was hers. Lady Agatha gave it to me a year ago. We were sitting together during a storm. She was tired. She pulled it from a small case and told me it was cursed. A stone soaked in guilt, she said. Then she pressed it into my hand and said, if I go before it's found, make sure it never sees the light again. She met Holmes's gaze steadily. I kept it hidden, thinking it was just a family keepsake. Only when you uncovered the rest did I understand its meaning. Where is it now? Holmes asked. I returned it, she said quietly. After you found the others, I returned to the manor the next morning. I placed it inside the old clock above the mantel. It was where Lady Agatha used to keep dried flowers. I thought, if she was still watching, she'd want it home. Holmes closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he rose. Watson, he said softly, tomorrow we retrieve the final piece. And then, I asked. Then we close the circle and ensure the stone that almost drove men to ruin is remembered only as a warning. We returned to Maple Heath under a sky the color of damp slate, a fine mist falling like powder over the hedgerows. The trees stood still, their skeletal arms bare, and the air had taken on that heavy quiet particular to English countryside just before the thaw. Holmes was unusually silent during the journey. He sat opposite me in the carriage, his eyes half-lidded but not asleep, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When he was in that state, I knew better than to speak. Thought, in Holmes, was a furnace that worked best with no interruption. At last, the manor came into view. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sound from the stables. Warburton had not returned, and the house stood cold and waiting, as if it knew our errand. Miss Fenwick had remained in London per Holmes's request. Whatever else she might have concealed, she had relinquished the truth when it mattered. Now came the act of confirmation. Holmes led the way into the drawing-room without hesitation. The great clock above the mantel loomed solemnly, its hands frozen at 11:15. Lady Agatha had once kept dried sprigs of lavender inside its false top, an old hiding place, now all but forgotten. With gloved hands, Holmes reached up and unlatched the top panel. It creaked open with a reluctant groan. Inside, nestled among the pale remnants of petals long crumbled, was the 12th ruby. He held it in his palm, examining the stone in the dull light that filtered through the curtained windows. It was no larger than the others, perhaps even less remarkable in cut. But its color was deeper, darker somehow, a crimson that hinted at something old and unresolved. Holmes turned it between his fingers. This was the first, he said softly. The one Sir Edmund likely kept apart from the rest. The one Lady Agatha feared most. And now, I asked, what will you do with it? He did not answer immediately. He placed the ruby in the velvet pouch with the others, then shut the clock face gently. There is one final matter, he said at last. Closure. We did not return to London straight away. Instead, Holmes directed our driver to take us to the village hall, where he requested a private meeting with the local magistrate. The man, a retired barrister with an unfortunate fondness for brandy, listened to Holmes's account with widening eyes. Holmes provided the ledgers, the pouch, and the full sequence of events, omitting only the brief concealment of the 12th gem by Miss Fenwick. When the magistrate asked whether charges were to be brought against Warburton or the housekeeper, Holmes merely said, "I believe the law has been served already, sir. Sometimes justice wears the face of silence, not retribution." By the time we returned to Baker Street that evening, the city had swallowed the fog again, and the gas lamps cast golden pools along the damp pavements. Holmes handed the pouch of rubies to a trusted contact at the Foreign Office the next morning, including the full documentation of their origin and rediscovery. As expected, the matter was quickly classified, the documents sealed, and a terse note of gratitude delivered to Holmes 3 days later. The Crown, it seemed, preferred its skeletons to remain buried in velvet-lined drawers. It was the following week when the unexpected arrived. I was in the sitting room reviewing some old case notes when Mrs. Hudson brought up a narrow envelope, unmarked except for our address and sealed with red wax. Holmes opened it with a knife, unfolded the single sheet inside, and read in silence. "Well?" I asked. He handed it to me. The handwriting was familiar, graceful but precise. "Mr. Holmes, I have returned to the north. My inheritance from Lady Agatha, what little there was in material, has been enough to rent a modest cottage. The rest I leave in your care. For what it's worth, I did not take the gem for gain. I took it because it was a piece of her, and because, perhaps foolishly, I believed I could protect what she could not. Thank you for seeing past the mask I wore. Yours with enduring respect, Isadora Fenwick. Holmes folded the note and slid it into his drawer without comment. She will be safe? I asked. As safe as any of us can be, Holmes replied. She is not a thief, Watson. She is a woman who was trusted by someone worth trusting. That is a rare enough thing. We sat in silence for a while after that, the fire hissing softly in the grate. The street sounds filtered in through the windows, the distant rattle of wheels, the clatter of hooves, the low murmur of life continuing beyond the walls of 221B. Holmes stared into the flames. You know, he said eventually, this case never hinged on the jewels. It was always about what people feared losing. Reputation, memory, peace. The rubies were merely the spark. And now that they're returned? I asked. He smiled faintly. The embers remain. They always do. That evening, as I closed my notebook, I reflected once more on the strange figure who had first crossed our threshold in her rain-colored dress. Miss Fenwick had seemed, at first glance, a creature of delicacy and silence. But there had been a quiet strength in her, too, a willingness to act in the space where others hesitated. Lady Agatha must have seen it. Holmes certainly had. I watched him lean back in his chair, his eyes closed, the faintest trace of soot still smudging the cuff of his sleeve. For all his brilliance, it was always in these quieter moments, when he acknowledged a kindness, a flaw, or a subtle truth, that Holmes revealed the better parts of himself. You'll write this one up, I trust, he murmured, not opening his eyes. Of course, I said, though I'm not sure the world will believe a lady's dress could have started it all. He gave a slight shrug. Truth rarely cares for disbelief. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft, steady, and cold. It tapped against the windows like a memory, one we'd agreed not to forget. And somewhere far from Baker Street, in a modest house surrounded by wind-worn hills, a woman folded away the last of her letters, lit a lamp, and looked toward the north-facing window. She, too, remembered. It was a quiet morning on Baker Street, the kind that clung to the edges of routine, where the kettle had boiled precisely twice before the post arrived, and Holmes had already completed a full monograph on the comparative ash residues of African and Turkish cigarettes. I was halfway, through trimming a quill when he looked up from his desk with that peculiar expression I had come to recognize as a prelude to disruption. Watson, he said without preamble, do you recall the name Inspector Alden? I nodded slowly. Of course. He was assigned to the Rivington case, wasn't he? A competent man, quiet, methodical. Precisely. Which is why I was rather intrigued to receive this. He slid an envelope across the desk. It was creased and bore the distinctive watermark of the Metropolitan Police. I unfolded it and read quickly. Mr. Holmes, I am writing to request your immediate consultation regarding a matter which may, at first glance, appear trivial. However, I believe you will find it of some relevance to the Warburton affair. We have recovered an item matching the description of the missing 12th ruby, recently discovered in a pawn shop off Fleet Street. The proprietor claims it was sold quietly, without name or receipt, by a man matching Lucien Warburton's build and manner. I hesitate to draw conclusions, but I fear we may not yet be finished with the matter. Inspector Alden. I looked up sharply. But Miss Fenwick said she returned the stone. We retrieved it ourselves. Holmes was already moving, slipping into his coat with that sudden fluidity that often followed new information. Exactly. And we did retrieve a 12th stone. The question is, was it the 12th stone? I stood slowly, heart sinking with a familiar dread. You think she substituted it? I think Holmes replied. That what we found in the clock was a stone, but it may not have been the one Sir Athelney Smale catalogued, or the one the Crown once lost. We accepted her confession too readily. And while I do believe Miss Fenwick meant to shield Lady Agatha's final wishes, it's entirely possible that someone else saw an opportunity where she saw only memory. We made our way through the early bustle of the city, carriages trundling through puddled streets and errand boys weaving like darting minnows between the wheels. Fleet Street yawned open with its usual chaos of ink and chatter. Holmes guided us to a narrow alley behind a stationery warehouse where a battered blue sign above a half-glass door read, "Dalton's Curios and Valuables. Discretion guaranteed." Inside, the shop smelled of varnish and pipe smoke. A squat man behind the counter looked up with eyes that had grown used to evaluating desperation. "You must be Mr. Dalton," Holmes said, offering his card. "You've had recent dealings with a red stone of unusual value." Dalton blinked. "Aye, that I have. Though I'll say I suspected it was too fine to be offered without question. Still, money's money. The man brought it in 3 days ago. No name, of course, but I remember his voice. Low, formal. Not a common thief." "Did he say anything else?" I asked. Dalton scratched his chin. "Only that the gem was from a family collection and he needed discretion. I've heard that 100 times. But I'll say this. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he feared someone might follow him." Holmes tapped his cane against the floor gently. "Do you still have the stone?" Dalton reached beneath the counter and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside lay a ruby, not quite as dark as the one from the clock, but dazzling nonetheless. Its facets caught the weak light and split it into veins of scarlet. Holmes examined it carefully, then drew from his coat a small jeweler's loupe and held it to his eye. "Excellent clarity," he murmured. "And, most tellingly, see here, Watson, this shallow nick along the girdle. The original registry described a matching imperfection. This is the Crown's ruby, the true 12th. I stared at him. "Then the stone we retrieved from Maple Heath was either a decoy," Holmes said grimly, "or an entirely different gem, chosen for its similarity, perhaps taken from Lady Agatha's personal collection." He turned to Dalton. "You will turn this over to Inspector Alden immediately. I'll send word. Expect a constable within the hour." As we stepped into the street, Holmes's face had taken on a harder cast, the sharpness behind his eyes now fully awoken. "There are only 3 people who could have orchestrated this," he said as we walked. "Warburton, of course, but he claimed he never found the box. Miss Fenwick, who knew of its existence, and Mrs. Prewitt, who had access to both the house and the hidden drawer." "But Warburton was the one seen selling it," I pointed out. Holmes nodded. "True, but that doesn't prove origin. A man desperate for money might be persuaded to offload something he did not himself obtain. The question becomes, who had the ruby between its disappearance and its sale?" He stopped abruptly. "We must return to Maple Heath, tonight." The sun was low when we arrived once more at the manor. The windows were shuttered, the gates locked. A lone groundsman opened the door and confirmed that Mrs. Prewitt had taken leave 2 days earlier, claiming illness. Holmes's face darkened. We searched her quarters, modest, neat, but empty of anything personal. However, in a drawer beneath a faded lace shawl, Holmes found something small and telling, a folded note in a woman's hand. "L, the ruby you wanted is safe. I kept it from the others as agreed. If you truly mean to protect the family name, then keep your word and send no more letters. I have done enough. P. L, I said. Lucienne. Holmes shook his head. Not necessarily. The language is cautious, protective. This was someone she trusted or feared enough to comply with. I suspect it was not Lucian she addressed. L could stand for something else, or it could be an initial from a private nickname. He pocketed the note and rose. But this confirms that Mrs. Prewitt knew of the ruby's true location, and she gave it, perhaps, reluctantly, to someone who then passed it to Warburton. Then Warburton was only the middleman, I asked. Perhaps, or perhaps he struck a deal with someone else to retrieve the stone and sell it on his behalf. Either way, it explains his discomfort during our first encounter. He wasn't lying, just hiding a deeper truth. That night we returned to Baker Street with more answers than questions, and yet the case no longer felt neatly tied. Holmes sat by the fire, the letter from Mrs. Prewitt in one hand, a brandy in the other. She wanted to protect someone, he said. Not Warburton, not herself. Possibly Miss Fenwick. Possibly someone entirely unseen. Then there's still a piece missing, I said. There always is, he murmured. But tonight, Watson, I shall allow it to remain missing. The stone is returned, the letters sealed, and the people left behind will decide whether truth should rest or rise again. He closed his eyes, and the fire flickered its way down into coals. Outside, the rain returned, washing the streets clean, or trying to. But some things, secrets, sins, rubies soaked in history, never quite fade. They glint in the dark, waiting for someone with the eye to see. The next morning began not with quiet reflection, as I had hoped, but with a brisk knock at the door. Sharp, deliberate, the kind of sound that foretold unwelcome continuity. Holmes had only just poured his tea, his gaze vacant in that way he often wore after a case was technically closed. I opened the door to find Inspector Alden standing in the hallway, his overcoat soaked with rain, his face lined with the exhaustion of someone who'd slept little and thought much. Holmes glanced up unperturbed. I expected you yesterday. Alden stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I might have come sooner, but I wanted to confirm the facts before bringing them to your table. Mr. Holmes, the ruby was real. It matched the archival gem down to the last imperfection, as you predicted. Holmes nodded faintly. And what of Warburton? Alden unbuttoned his coat with a sigh. We questioned him early this morning. He claims he was contacted by letter, anonymous but familiar in tone. The message instructed him to retrieve the gem from beneath the floorboard of the gardener's shed at Maple Heath. He insists he didn't steal it, only passed it on for money, as requested. Claims he needed the funds to pay off a debt. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Did he say who contacted him? No name. Just the letter, and it's vanished now, of course. Of course. But we did check the shed, Alden continued, and we found evidence that something was buried and then dug up recently. The loose earth, disturbed planks. Whoever planted the ruby there meant for it to be found quickly. Holmes stood and walked to the fireplace, which suggests intent. Someone calculated that Warburton would follow instructions, without question, that he would pass the gem into the world with no idea of its true significance. That, in turn, leads us back to the real architect. Alden exhaled. You think he's being used? I believe, Holmes said carefully, that the pawnshop sale was never about profit. It was about creating a trail, one that ends at Warburton's feet. He turned to me. Watson, the language in Mrs. Prewitt's note, the reference to protecting the family name, was oddly formal for someone like her. She was speaking in someone else's voice, someone who persuaded her to part with the ruby and to deliver it through clandestine means. And I think I know who that someone was. I sat forward. Not Fenwick. No, Holmes said, but connected to her. There's a name we've not heard in all this, a man who has remained curiously absent. Alden frowned. You mean there's another Warburton? Not a Warburton, Holmes replied, but someone Lady Agatha trusted. Someone close to the family, but beneath the line of inheritance. Someone who moved quietly around the estate, who had access to the household secrets, who remained in the background through all our interviews. His voice dropped, as if he were speaking less to us than to the room itself. The groundskeeper. Hensley Alden blinked. But he's, what, 60, 70? Elderly, yes, Holmes admitted. But do not mistake age for impotence. If anything, it's the perfect disguise. Who notices the old man who's always been there? Who asks what he carries when he walks the perimeter of a house he's served for 4 decades? He turned to Alden again. I need access to the Warburton family wills, and I need it today. The inspector gave a tired nod. I'll have a clerk open the archive. By early afternoon, we were seated at the Public Records Office with 3 wills spread before us. Sir Edmund Warburton's, Lady Agatha's, and one belonging to a distant cousin who had died in 1870. Holmes scanned the documents swiftly, eyes darting across clauses and signatures. There, he said suddenly. Read this, Watson. I leaned closer. In the final paragraph of Lady Agatha's will, beneath the formal bequests and property divisions, was a curious line. To my long-serving steward and companion, Mr. Clarence Hensley, I leave a discretionary stipend in recognition of his loyalty and in acknowledgement of our shared knowledge, which shall remain unspoken but honored until the last. Shared knowledge, I murmured. She knew. Not just knew, Holmes said. She entrusted him with the truth, perhaps even with the rubies themselves once upon a time, and perhaps he kept one, not out of greed, but to safeguard something deeper. Such as control. If Hensley had one ruby, he held leverage, perhaps against Warburton, perhaps against the Crown, or perhaps he feared that when Agatha died, others would seek the gems for themselves, and he took one as insurance. Alden leaned in. So the man who posed as a harmless servant may be the linchpin of the entire affair. Holmes nodded grimly. And if he believes that chain of secrecy is about to break, he may already be gone. We returned to Maple Heath by evening, the wind rising through the trees in low groans. The groundsman's cottage stood dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. Holmes knocked once, twice. No answer. Alden forced the door with a muttered apology. Inside, the cottage was clean, too clean. The bed was made, the stove cold, a trunk packed neatly by the door. On the table, beneath a glass of water, sat a folded envelope addressed to S. H. Holmes, opened it slowly. Mr. Holmes, I suspect this will reach you sooner than I would like. I never meant to deceive, only to preserve what Lady Agatha asked me to protect. She did not trust the Warburtons. Not Edmund, not Lucien, and she feared what the rubies would mean if they fell into the wrong hands. The 12th gem I kept not for gain, but for balance, a silent guarantee that I could ensure silence from others. I never intended to use it, but time changes resolve and fear. Well, it speaks louder than conscience in the end. Mrs. Prewitt acted on my request. Warburton acted on his desperation. I alone bear the fault. I've gone north, where the stones mean nothing and the ground is too cold to dig. Let the others bury their guilt. I shall bury mine. C.H. We stood in silence for a long time. Then Holmes folded the letter, slipped it into his coat, and stepped back outside into the wind. As we made our way back through the trees, I asked quietly, "Do you believe he meant to flee justice?" "No," Holmes replied. "I believe he meant to flee memory. Sometimes, Watson, guilt is a weight the law cannot match." "And the case?" He glanced at me sideways. "The case is closed. The truth has been revealed in fragments, like broken glass. But we have enough to see its shape." "And the rubies?" He gave a weary smile. "Returned, recovered, and yet still red." The path behind us narrowed into fog as we walked on. Somewhere out there, Hensley was retreating into obscurity. Somewhere behind us, a family manor stood hollow, the ghosts of its secrets folding into the walls. And ahead, always ahead, waited the next mystery, the next faint knock, the next truth waiting to be uncovered by the man who saw not just what was there, but what had been deliberately left out. The days that followed brought a return to something like stillness. The fog of the Warburton affair, though not fully dispersed, had thinned enough for Baker Street to resume its more familiar rhythm. Holmes resumed his experiments with quiet precision, and I turned again to my notes, attempting to piece together the final threads of the case in a manner worthy of the quiet elegance it had possessed. Yet beneath that surface calm, I could feel something still unsettled. Holmes, for all his visible composure, had not touched his violin in 3 days. It was on the 4th morning, as I set down a fresh cup of coffee beside him, that he broke the silence. "There is something unfinished, Watson." I met his gaze. I rather suspected as much. He rose from his chair and walked to the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing the edge of the mantel. Hensley's departure closed the practical matter. The rubies are recovered, the law is content, and the family scandal, such as it was, has receded from public scrutiny. But there is something deeper, something about the why of it all that remains elusive. The motive? Yes, he said slowly, but not merely in the criminal sense. I've been wondering what truly drove Lady Agatha to conceal the stones in the first place. Fear, certainly. Loyalty, perhaps. But there was something more. She chose to live with the knowledge of a theft unreported, a guilt unatoned. Why? I considered that for a moment. She may have feared what exposure would bring, the shame it would cast on her late husband, the stain on the Warburton name. Holmes nodded. All true, but there is still a particular contradiction. If she feared that shame, why not destroy the rubies outright? Why hide them so deliberately, so artfully? I set my cup down. You believe she intended for them to be found? Eventually, he replied, but only by someone who would understand not just their value, but their weight. He turned toward me, the firelight casting narrow shadows beneath his cheekbones. And that person, Watson, may not have been Hensley, nor Warburton, nor even Miss Fenwick. A pause. Then he crossed the room and opened his desk drawer. From it, he withdrew the letter Miss Fenwick had sent weeks earlier, the one where she claimed to have returned the ruby to the clock. Holmes laid it flat on the table. You remember this, of course. Of course. He pointed to the last paragraph. Thank you for seeing past the mask I wore. Now, consider that phrasing. It suggests she deliberately concealed something, not out of deceit, but necessity. She said as much when we confronted her. Yes, Holmes murmured. But now read the rest of the letter. She refers to the ruby in the singular. She refers to Lady Agatha in emotional, even possessive terms, and yet she never once claims to have understood the full history of the rubies, only that she believed the one she held was a piece of her. I leaned in. You think she didn't know about the others? I think, Holmes said, that she may have known only about the one. He crossed to the fireplace again, then stopped and turned slowly. Hensley's letter to me makes it clear he acted to protect the family name. He mentions persuading Prewitt to help, but there's one inconsistency I cannot reconcile. Which is... Hensley claims he feared the stones falling into the wrong hands. That's why he hid one. But he didn't hide it very well. Under a floorboard, in a shed. It's too vulnerable, too easily found. A man like Hensley, with decades of experience on that land, would have done better. Unless, I said, catching the thread, he wanted someone specific to find it. Holmes smiled faintly. Just so. And who would have the right combination of desperation, access, and ignorance? Warburton. Holmes nodded. Warburton. Hensley may have known he would take the bait, and that the ruby would be sold quickly, drawing public attention. That sale triggered an official inquiry, and that inquiry led inevitably to you and me. I stared. You're suggesting Hensley's intent all along was to involve you? Holmes lowered himself into his chair and steepled his fingers. Not me personally, perhaps, but someone who would see what others had missed, someone not bound by blood or sentiment. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out a second letter, this one bearing the Warburton seal. It had arrived 2 days prior, he now admitted, but he had held it in reserve. I read aloud, "Mr. Holmes, my late aunt once said that truth is only valuable in the hands of those who won't sell it. I did not understand her then. I do now. Whatever your conclusions, I will not contest them. I have no desire to reclaim anything that was hidden for such a reason. The house is yours to search if you feel it necessary. I am leaving England for a time. There are names easier to carry elsewhere. L.W." "Guilt," I said, folding the letter, "or something close to it." "Guilt is a fine sculptor," Holmes said. "It shapes a man into what he pretends not to be. But Warburton was never the villain of this tale. He was the smoke. Someone else lit the match." He stood and crossed to the window. "Still," he murmured, "there's one final place we've not looked." He said no more until the following morning when we returned, perhaps for the last time, to Maple Heath Manor. The house was empty. A single caretaker met us with keys and departed swiftly. Holmes walked the halls as if revisiting a dream, pausing now and then at corners and doorways as though listening for echoes. At last, we reached the library, Lady Agatha's private refuge, long sealed and preserved. The room was dim but rich with dust and memory. The books stood in solemn ranks. The air had the faint scent of paper and old camphor. Holmes ran a gloved finger along the edge of the writing desk. "This," he said softly, "is where the truth ends." He opened the top drawer. Inside were letters, dried ink, and a small leather-bound ledger. Holmes opened it. We read the final entry together. "If these stones are found, let it be by someone who understands their cost. I've paid mine, but the debt is not only mine to carry. Let someone see them for what they are, not wealth, not history, but mirrors. Let them see what greed reflects. If he reads this, tell him I never blamed him. Not truly. Tell him I knew what he meant to protect." A.W. Holmes closed the book and remained still for a long moment. Then he turned, placed the ledger gently in his coat, and walked toward the door. Outside, the sun had begun to pierce the mist. The hedges glistened. The trees no longer whispered. We did not speak again until we were halfway to the station. Then Holmes said, as if concluding a long conversation with himself, "The true mystery, Watson, was never in who hid the rubies. It was in who couldn't let them go." I nodded. And beside us, the manor receded into the morning, its secrets told, its weight lifted, and its silence finally earned. The final days of the Warburton affair unfolded not in the clamor of scandal, but in the quiet breath of understanding. The newspapers, having caught wind of a mysterious jewel retrieval from a pawnshop on Fleet Street, speculated wildly about noble families and smuggled heirlooms. But no names were printed. The Crown's silence ensured the public's interest waned as swiftly as it rose. Officially, the case was declared resolved. Unofficially, it was placed among those peculiar investigations whose truths remain whispered between a select few. We were seated once again in the rooms at Baker Street. Holmes had spent the better part of the morning in solitude, reading over Lady Agatha's final ledger. When he finally looked up, there was a calm in his eyes. Not triumph, but something rarer. Reflection. "It was never about the rubies, Watson," he said softly. "They were the spark, yes, but the true fire ran through the souls who guarded them." I nodded, watching as he closed the ledger and placed it beside his chair. "She feared what the gems represented," I said. "Not just theft, but what they might awaken in those who found them." Holmes tapped the edge of the desk. "And so she built a test, not a puzzle for me to solve, but a measure of character. Hensley, Warburton, Miss Fenwick, each played a role. Each was tested in their own way." "Hensley with loyalty disguised as secrecy," I said. "Warburton with shame struggling against pride. And Miss Fenwick, she was the one who saw most clearly, wasn't she? She was, Holmes replied. Though she never fully grasped the weight of what she held, she understood its danger, and perhaps more importantly, she knew when to let it go. That is what separated her from the others. He rose and paced to the window, folding his hands behind his back. Hensley feared exposure. Warburton feared judgment. But Lady Agatha feared only one thing, that her silence might outlive her intentions, and so she left traces, not to reveal the past, but to preserve what decency remained in those around her. He turned toward me. The final clue, Watson, was not the ruby. It was the letter she wrote in that ledger. The words, "Let someone see them for what they are. Not wealth, not history, but mirrors." I understood then the depth of the case. Each person who touched those stones had seen a version of themselves reflected back. Desire, fear, regret. And in the end, the mystery had not been about solving a crime, but understanding the true cost of keeping one buried. Later that afternoon, a small envelope arrived at Baker Street, its seal unmarked. Inside was a note on plain paper and a sprig of dried lavender. Holmes unfolded it and read silently. "Mr. Holmes, the house is sold." I left the ledger in the desk. Let whoever comes next read what they must. There is no longer a secret to guard. Thank you for treating her memory gently and for seeing what the rest could not. I'm leaving for the coast. There are no stones there, only waves. That will be enough. I.F. Holmes laid the letter on the mantel beside his violin and did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was low. "Do you know what makes a case beautiful, Watson? Not the twist, not the solution, but the people it reveals, the ones who surprise us, the ones who quietly carry more than they should." He looked toward the window, where the light was beginning to fade into the familiar London dusk. "And sometimes," he said, "it is the ones we almost overlooked who carry the final piece." I nodded slowly, committing the words to memory. That evening, as the city dimmed and the fire crackled low, Holmes took out his violin at last. The notes that followed were not triumphant nor melancholy. They were searching, like the echo of something once hidden that had, at last, come home. And I, seated by the hearth, understood then that this case, like the rain-colored dress in which it began, had never been about brilliance or deduction, but about understanding the quiet power of what lingers just beneath the surface. The truth, Holmes had often said, does not shout, it waits. And in the case of the lady in the rain-colored dress, it waited with grace, until someone finally listened, 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 finally listened,